Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can't really see you there with all the bright lights. I can just see some shapes, but it's a great pleasure to be back in Barcelona, and many congratulations on your 25th anniversary. What I want to do is divide my talk into two. First of all, I want to talk about what we can learn about pension design from economic theory, and then I want to look at the challenges that pension systems face and what policy directions they imply. Starting off with lessons from economic theory, there's 7 lessons that I will talk about, some of them more fully than others. First of all, the simple economic model is not enough. Secondly, imperfect behavior and non-rational behavior are pervasive. 3, there's information problems also on the supply side in providing annuities. Fourthly, if you've got population aging, funding is not necessarily an automatic solution. 5, a question that isn't asked often enough: how should risks be shared? 6, the different distributional effects of different pension designs. And finally, a sort of summary conclusion. So, starting point, core objective: pensions are about economic security in old age. People sometimes say they're part of making an economy grow. Making an economy grow is an important objective. It is not the primary objective of pension systems. The primary objective of pension systems is to allow people of working age like you to transfer consumption securely to the time when you've retired. So achieving old age security includes consumption smoothing across a person's lifetime, redistribution from yourself in middle years to yourself when you're older. It includes insurance against income risks during working life and in old age, and it includes poverty relief. So, lesson 1, the simple model is not enough. Simple economic model. Most of us, I suspect, did economics at some stage. Economics 1, rational consumers, competitive markets, simple, homogeneous products, etc. Now, that's a useful benchmark for thinking about things, but basing policy on that simple model is mistaken. What's needed is what economists call second best analysis. What are the problems with the simple model? Well, first of all, there's imperfect information, which is addressed by the economics of information, for which the Nobel Prize was awarded in 2001. Second, you have non-rational behavior, behavior beyond the simple idea of rationality in the first best model, addressed by behavioral economics, for which the Nobel Prize was awarded in 2002 and then again last week. You've got incomplete markets and incomplete contracts, for which the Nobel Prize was awarded in 2016 and was also cited in the 2010 Nobel Prize. And you've got distortionary taxation. If you have poverty relief in a system, you have to tax richer people in order to subsidize poorer people. That's distortionary. That's addressed by the literature on optimal taxation, for which the Nobel Prize was awarded in 1996. So you're saying, why is he going on about all these Nobel Prizes? Well, the reason is that I want to make it clear that what I'm going to be talking about is not some peculiar, idiosyncratic Nick Barr left-wing view of the world. It's rooted in the very best of modern economics. So that's the first lesson. The simple model isn't enough. The second model is that imperfect information and non-rational behavior are pervasive, and I suspect this is something that a lot of you know a great deal about. Let me start off with lessons from the economics of information. In pensions, as in many areas of economics, the model of the well-informed consumer doesn't always hold. In the context of pensions, a survey of 50%, in a survey, 50% of Americans didn't know the difference between a stock and a bond. And at this stage, I look at my LSE students, graduate students, and say, put your hand up if you're really sure you know the difference between a stock and a bond. And about 1/3 of them put up their hands. And another third, half put up their hands. Now, if graduate students at the London School of Economics aren't aware, aren't confident they know about a distinction as basic as that, then basing pensions policy on the assumption that the population understands these things is mistaken. Most people don't understand the need to switch from equities to bonds as they approach retirement if they hold an individual account, and few people realize the significance of administrative costs, which is something I will come back to later. So you've got information problems, you've got problems of non-rational behavior. Conventional theory predicts you will all be saving voluntarily the optimal amount. You will choose to retire at the optimal time. You will optimize you will voluntarily choose the optimal fraction of your pension savings to convert into annuities. But of course, that's not what happens. One can distinguish between bounded rationality and bounded willpower. Bounded rationality is the problem that arises where the problem is too complicated for people to know what they ought to do. And in the face of bounded rationality, you observe procrastination. People delay saving, delay making decisions. Inertia, people stay where they're put. Hence, auto-enrollment has a much higher participation rate than a system without auto-enrollment. And this was, one of the insights and policy proposals of Richard Thaler. Or people do nothing. They're immobilized. They're like rabbits in a car headlight. They just don't know what to do, so they do nothing. Bounded willpower, people know they ought to save, but they don't save, or they don't save enough. Why does this happen? Whoops. Why does this happen? Well, evidence from behavioral economics, there's a famous experiment. As you came into the seminar this morning, there was a sign-up sheet for next week's seminar, and you could choose your snack, and you could choose between chocolate and fruit salad. And 2/3 of you choose fruit salad because you know that's the healthier option. But as you actually came in up there, there was a table with bowls of fruit salad and bars of chocolate. And 2/3 of you chose the chocolate. And the reason for that, so what that says is we're rational for the future. Next week we'll have fruit salad. We're not rational for the present. The problem is the future becomes the present. And we can explain this. Clinical measurement of brain activity. As you know, there are different parts of our brain. The oldest bit, the animal bit, is the mesolimbic system. It's the me, now, eat this as quickly as possible. It may be the last meal I ever have. The prefrontal cortex is a newer bit of the brain. It's rational, it's patient, it's rational economic man and women. And as we know, in all of us, life is a constant battle between the two parts. We know we should lose a bit of weight, but now's a stressful time and now's not the good time to start dieting. We know we ought to smoke less, we know we ought to go to the gym, but now is never a good time to do it. So life is a constant battle between the two parts. Did I go to the conference dinner last night and enjoy good Spanish wine, or did I go to the hotel and try and get an early night because I'm speaking this morning? On this occasion, I'm pleased to say the prefrontal cortex won, but I can't guarantee that that's always the case. So this calls into question the simple model of long-term rationality, which then brings us on to financial literacy, which I always thought was bad, but I had no idea how bad it was. This is an international study by Linda Lusardi and Olivia Mitchell. It was designed to be internationally comparative. They asked respondents 3 questions, and I'm only going to ask you the first. You've got $100 in a bank account. The bank account pays 2% in interest. After 5 years, how much would you have in the account? $102, more than $102, less than $102. And the other 2 questions were equally simple. Now, you would expect everybody, most people, to get these right. Well, the results that they found were that in the United States, the heart of capitalism, only 1/3 of respondents got all 3 questions right. And in perfectly sensible, well-run countries like Italy, Sweden, Japan, New Zealand, about 25% got all 3 right. In Russia, 2% got all 3 right. So there is a real problem about people having the capacity to make the right decisions, and it gets worse because you've got problems of people who could, in principle, make the right decision, but don't. This is behavior by financially knowledgeable people who simply don't do it. For example, I am profoundly grateful I belong to an occupational scheme. It saves me having to think about these things. So you can't just say people will make rational decisions. Many of them can't, and even if they can, very often they won't. So all this has important implications for policy design. First of all, giving people less choice is part of good policy design. Giving people too much choice can actually lower their welfare. It interferes with decision making. It makes them feel worried. So the policy directions are to constrain choice about how much to save, for example, having a savings mandate or at least a very powerful nudge, and also constrained choice of pension provider, so giving people a limited menu of options. The second implication is don't overstate what financial education is capable of achieving. Financial education is hugely important. It ought to be part of the school curriculum everywhere. But what its purpose is to explain to people why they shouldn't be maxing out on their credit card. It won't turn them into financially sophisticated consumers. And even for a well-informed person, there are high transactions costs in comparing complex options, and there are administrative costs. Choice is costly. And the figure I always use is, and it's the only piece of pension advice I ever give people is to say, look at the administrative charges. If your fund has an annual management charge of 1%, then over a full career, the accumulation is 20% smaller because of that 1% charge than it would be without it. So administrative charges and reducing administrative costs is enormously important. A third implication is don't overstate the usefulness of choice and competition. People say competition's good. Competition is great for cars and restaurants and smartphones. But it works well in those circumstances because people, by and large, are reasonably well informed. It doesn't work well where people are not well informed. Pension systems are complex, systems where workers have to choose from competing private providers. There's information and behavioural problems that I've talked about. There's high administrative costs. Choice, giving people choice, is the wrong model. Now, this is not a condescending remark by an elderly professor of economics. You are not given free choice of pharmaceutical drugs. None of us can go into the pharmacy and buy any pharmaceutical drugs we like over the counter. It is thought we don't know enough to make those choices. And I think pensions are much more like pharmaceutical drugs than they are like smartphones. And as an illustration of that, I was asked by the government of Sweden to write a report on their pension system, which with a small part of workers' contributions, workers have to choose a pension fund from 830 pension funds. And the night before I delivered my report, I was having dinner in Stockholm with two old friends, someone who essentially ran their pension system and someone who was very much involved in designing the system. And I was saying to them over dinner that if I were a Swedish worker, I wouldn't have a clue about choosing a good pension fund. I'd be in the default fund, which is the fund that they have for workers who make no choice. So I said, I wouldn't have a clue, I'd be in the default fund. And they looked at me and they laughed and they said, we're in the default fund. The person running the system and the person who designed the system. So choice and competition is the wrong model. It uses what economists call a first best model in second best circumstances. Now, I'm not criticizing pension funds here. I'm saying it's the wrong model. And with a better model, pension funds could still pursue their important objective of fund management, but in a way that is less expensive. Final implication, incentives matter, but not as much as people think. The argument is if people's pensions depend on their contributions, then they know if they don't contribute, they won't get a pension, therefore they will contribute and compliance will be better. That's what first best analysis says. It says people will behave rationally, but it's not true. There's a famous example. In the US, once you are 59 and a half years old, you can take money out of your 401k pension plan. Many employers match the contributions of their workers. So you are an American worker, you're aged 59, you've got 6 months to retire. How much are you going to put into your 401k plan? You're going to put in as much as you possibly can, because the employer will match it, you will double your money, and in 6 months' time, you can withdraw it tax-free. So it's obvious you'd be putting in as much money as possible. Except that's not what workers do. There's very little effect. So don't overestimate the effect of incentives. So that's in a way lesson 2, that information and behavioural problems are pervasive, and that has major implications for pension design. Lesson 3, I've separated out from lesson 2 because it's relevant to actuaries, but it's part of the same package, that you've got horrible information problems on the supply side of the annuities market, and that causes major problems. The starting point for me is the distinction between risk and uncertainty. With risk, you have a reasonably good idea of the probability distribution of outcomes. With uncertainty, you know there is a distribution, but you're not at all sure what it is. You're not sure about the mean, and there's a large variance about it. Now, in the case of annuities, there are 2 uncertainties. One is inflation in retirement, which everyone has always realized is a problem. But there's one that I think is less realized, and that is that the remaining life expectancy of someone who turns up to buy an annuity, I think, is not a risk, it's more like an uncertainty, because we know almost everywhere people are living longer than the official projections suggest. And that's causing losses to the sellers of annuities, who therefore price their annuities cautiously, and therefore the market thins out. And we've seen that in the United Kingdom. And there is an important role for the state there in completing the market. The government already completes the market in terms of inflation insurance by providing index-linked government bonds. There is a strong case for having longevity bonds in which the government says that if a cohort lives longer than the official projection of their life expectancy, the extra cost will be picked up by the taxpayer. That allows annuity providers to price annuities on the official projections of life expectancy without having to allow for a margin in case people live longer than that. So One approach to this is for the state to complete the market with longevity bonds. The other approach is what they do in Sweden, where everybody is obliged to buy an annuity from a single seller of monopoly seller of annuities, the government of Sweden. Lesson 4. This is very much aimed at actuaries. This is something I first wrote about nearly 40 years ago, and it's a myth that is still widely believed, that funding is somehow a solution to population aging. And let me talk a bit about this. There are only two ways of organising consumption for your old age. You can either, the first method is to store current production. So you take 10% of what you produce this year and you dig a hole in the bottom of your garden and you bury part of what you've produced this year in it. So you bury tins of baked beans and boxes of wine and bottles of paracetamol, and you just add to that each year, and then when you retire you dig it up and that's what you consume in retirement. Now that approach has got obvious problems. First of all, it's expensive. It's expensive to keep a steak frozen for 30 years. It is a negative real rate of return to your pension savings, whereas if you hold them in financial assets, one hopes for a positive real return. Secondly, there's uncertainty. You may like full-bodied red wine now, but by the time you've retired, you might prefer lighter white wine, or you may have enjoyed the red wine so much that your liver has collapsed and you're not drinking wine at all. Thirdly is the problem of services. You can store services that derive from physical capital. You can store television services by burying a television in the hole at the bottom of your garden. But you can't store services that derive from human capital. Medical services. What you can't do is bury a young doctor in the hole in the bottom of your garden so that he or she can look after you when you're old. So storing current production doesn't really work. That means you need to, what you're left with is building a claim to future production. What you're doing now is building a claim to output produced by younger workers after you've retired. And the key point there is pensioners aren't interested in money. Money is coloured bits of paper with portraits of national heroes on them. Pensioners are interested in consumption, food and clothing and heating and presents for their grandchildren and tickets to the football match. So pensioners can consume only what workers produce but do not themselves consume. Pay-as-you-go and funding are simply different financial mechanisms for organising claims on future output. So the difference between the two approaches shouldn't be exaggerated, and the key message is what matters is output. And just to illustrate, this is a very oversimplified illustration, but it makes the point. Imagine that you are the baby boom generation and you're followed by a much smaller generation, me. So there's a lot of you, there's only one of me. You all save in your pension funds, and for simplicity we assume you save cash, you put it into bank accounts. And when you retire, the idea is it doesn't matter that there's a lot of you and only one of me, because you've each provided for your own retirement through your own pension savings. But the problem is, when you come to retire, you want to spend the money. What do you spend it on? Answer, current production. Who's producing that current production? Answer, me. Am I producing enough, other things equal, to satisfy all your demands? Answer, no. So you're going to spend your money, there's not going to be enough output, the result is going to be price inflation. So you're not going to get the consumption for which you planned because the output isn't there to support it. So you then say, well, we wouldn't save in bank accounts, we would save in equities. But when you come to retire, you can't spend equities. You need to sell them to get the cash to buy the goods. To whom do you sell the equities? Answer, me. Do I want to buy as many equities as you want to sell? No, I don't. So you'll get an asset market crash. So the only point I want to make is you can't just assume that looking after people's savings safely will solve the demographic problem. Savings are part of it, but the key point is output. And the next slide simply makes the point that if output grows enough, then the problems in the previous slide disappear. So that then says what matters is output. So then you say, well, where does higher output come from? And there's two ways you can increase output. You can make each individual worker more productive, or you can have more workers. You make each worker more productive by giving him or her better capital equipment, better physical capital, and by investing in a person's human capital, in their skills. And you can increase the number of workers from each age cohort by having higher labour force participation, by having a later retirement age, by importing labour directly through immigration, or by importing labour indirectly by exporting capital to countries with a young population. So remember this, there are many different ways of increasing output, and the conclusion is that in the face of demographic problems, the key variable is output. Moving to funded pensions is helpful in addressing population aging only if it increases output, and policy should consider the entire menu of policies to increase output that I listed on the previous slide. So that brings us on to a series of other lessons. Risk sharing is central and often overlooked. I will come back to this in the policy discussion, so I just want to mention this now. I don't want to overrun my time. A sixth lesson is different choices have different distributional implications. Just to give an example, when America introduced pay-as-you-go pensions under the 1935 Social Security Act, it meant that people who were retired in 1935 got a pension. If instead they'd introduced a funded plan, those older workers who'd lived through the Great Depression wouldn't have got a pension. So any choice about how you fund pensions, funding versus pay-as-you-go, of necessity is also a choice about intergenerational redistribution. So let me come to my last theory slide, which is a core conclusion that Peter Diamond and I came to in a long book on pensions we wrote, published about 10 years ago. And that is, there are sound principles of pension design, but no single best pension system for all countries. So when people say, if people say to you, what's the best pension system? Or when they say to me, what's the best pension system? I say, there isn't a single best one. There are a range of good designs. And the reason is very straightforward. We've got multiple objectives: consumption, smoothing, insurance, poverty relief. You've got multiple constraints: fiscal capacity, institutional capacity, things like that, political constraints. The reason there is no single best system is that at different times and in different places, policymakers will attach different relative weights to the different objectives, and countries will face different patterns of the constraints. If the objectives differ and the constraints differ, the optimum will differ, and that's why pension systems look different across countries, and this is entirely as it should be. There's a very good pension system in the Netherlands, which is different from the good one in Sweden, which is different from the good one in Canada, which is different from the good one in New Zealand. That's not a problem. So economic theory's got a lot to say about pension design, but I now want to come on to challenges and solutions. And I wanted, if I've got time, to talk about four. First problem is more fluid labour market relations, then demographic change, then addressing risk and uncertainty, and then a brief conclusion. So here's the problem. In 1950, you had full-time, long-term employment as the norm. Today, you've got much greater diversity. You've got different forms of labour market relations, employed, self-employed, outside the labour force. You've got full-time, part-time, zero-hour contracts, etc. You've got long-term contracts, short-term contracts. You've got formal or informal. And people move across these more than they did in the past. And what that means is that basing pension entitlements on contributions related to a person's employment status works less well today than in the past. Example, the UK. In 2005, a basic state pension, to get a full basic state pension, you needed to have contributed for over 40 years. And in 2005, about 85% of men retiring were entitled to a full basic state pension, but only 30% of women. And that was despite the fact that women at home caring after young children, those were counted as contribution years. And the cause is not faulty administration. It's that there is a less good fit of the employment-related contributions model to today's labour markets than was the case in the past. So what's the policy direction? Well, I'm increasingly attracted to the idea of non-contributory pensions, sometimes referred to as social pensions. In other words, a flat-rate, tax-financed pension based on age and residence. Seen through the eyes of the Ministry of Social Security, this arrangement has major advantages. It strengthens poverty relief in terms of coverage, adequacy, and gender balance. Women, on average, have less good contribution records than men, so a non-contributory benefit disproportionately benefits women. It shares risk with the taxpayer, since it's tax-financed, and hence can be shared through government borrowing with past and future cohorts. You can make it fit different budget envelopes, which I will come on to shortly, and it makes fewer demands on institutional capacity than contributory systems. To administer a non-contributory benefit, you need to know two things. One, have they reached pension age? And two, have they been in the country for long enough? You don't need a continuous record of contributions. From the worry from the point of view of the Ministry of Finance is, can we afford these things? And the answer is, there are three instruments for making a pension design fit a given budget envelope. Obviously, first of all, the level of the monthly benefit, but also, and importantly, the age at which the benefit starts. When Peter Diamond and I were asked to advise the government of China and advocated a non-contributory pension, we said the level should be high enough to provide genuine poverty relief. If that can't be afforded at age 60, then think about it at age 65 or even age 70. And the third instrument is, do you give everybody a non-contributory pension, or do you impose what I call an affluence test? With an income test, you're trying to make sure only poor people get the benefit. With an affluence test, most people get the benefit, but you're screening out the best off. So, for example, in Canada, there is a non-contributory benefit, and 95% of Canadians get the full benefit. It's the top 5% it's screened out for. Country examples: Australia, Canada, Chile, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and a range of developing countries. So this is not some fanciful academic idea, it's an idea that works in practice. So more fluid labour market relations is the first challenge. I would say at least part of the solution to think about is non-contributory pensions. Second challenge that we all know about, demographic change. And there are two bits to this: is people are living longer and people are having fewer children. and they need to be discussed separately. Longer lives, first of all. People are living longer. This is wonderful good news. This is arguably the greatest welfare triumph of the 20th century. When I talk to my students, I always say to them that my students and I all play by the same rules. They are as entitled to express a personal view as I am, but they, like me, will be publicly humiliated for faulty logic. But I say there is one exception. If you use the term the aging problem, you will fail. The aging problem is an ideologically unsound concept. There isn't an aging problem. There is an early retirement problem. And clearly the solution, if people are living longer lives, is that they should work longer. So earliest pension age should rise in a rational way as life expectancy increases, and that should be combined not only later retirement but also more flexible retirement. Briefly on that, when retirement was invented in the late 19th century, for example in New Zealand, the idea was that you had doddering old workers in the factory, round the farmyard, lowering the productivity of younger workers. It's me coming into your office and saying, I'm very sorry, can you show me how to switch on your on my computer, and accidentally hitting your keyboard and messing up your screen. Older workers were lowering the productivity of younger workers. Someone aged 65 was very old indeed and very unproductive. And the purpose of pensions was to get deadwood out of the labour force. So it made sense to say, when you turn 65, you must retire, and you must retire completely. So cliff edge retirement. Since then, two things have happened. People are living longer, healthy lives, which means they should work longer. But also, we've become richer as societies, which means that we can afford to give people a period of leisure at the end of their working life. But that means that the purpose of pensions has changed. It's no longer to get rid of dead wood, it's a social device for sharing adult life between working years and retirement years. And that says it would be a good idea to give people choice about how they move from full-time work to full retirement, and that would be a good thing to do even if there were no problem about paying for pensions. So the solution, the policy direction that longevity suggests is later earliest pension age, lower fertility. With fewer children, the policy direction is more saving. Declining fertility means the workforce in the future will be smaller. If output falls, there will be problems paying for pensions. You want to avoid output falling, so the way to address declining fertility is to make each member of the future smaller workforce more productive, and you do that by investing in his or her physical capital and his or her human capital. So you need more investment in order to boost the productivity of individual workers, and to that end, higher saving is important. So the key policy driver to address declining fertility is more saving, but hugely important message, there are many different ways of organising pension saving. You can have individual funded accounts, and that's one way, but it's only one way. There are others. Fully funded individual accounts from multiple competing providers, as in Chile or Australia. Simpler, cheaper individual accounts with less choice, like the Thrift Savings Plan in the United States or Nest Pensions in the UK. You can have fully funded occupational industry plans, as in the Netherlands. You can have partially funded national plans like the notional defined contribution system in Sweden. You can have partially funded national defined benefit plans, as in Canada. Or you can have partially funded defined benefit with risk sharing. And those are all ways of having more savings inside the pension system, but you can also have more saving outside the pension saving, for example, the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Norway. So, a couple of examples. First of all, simple savings and annuities. I've talked about the reasons why choice and competition is the wrong model. You've got imperfect information, you've got bounded rationality, you've got bounded willpower, you've got high administrative costs. And what those imply for pension design is, first of all, make pensions mandatory, or if that's not politically possible, use automatic enrolment. Secondly, keep choices simple. Having highly constrained choice is a deliberate design feature. Have a good default option for people who make no choice. I will come back to that. Keep administrative costs low by separating two aspects of pension saving. What I call account administration is the record keeping, it's the back office stuff. And account administration should be centralized because there's potential economies of scale. The other bit is fund management. Fund management, what assets do fund managers use people's pension savings to buy? Now, that's a different part of the puzzle. That is a hugely important task. The purpose of financial markets is to channel your and my individual savings into productive investment. That's best done by the private sector. So, separating those two out is an important part of the puzzle. Country examples, well, the US Thrift Savings Plan for federal civil servants has got auto-enrollment. Workers have a choice. They choose a fund from 5 funds, but there's a default for workers who make no choice. The account administration, the administration stuff is centralised. There's wholesale fund management. The UK National Employment Savings Trust, Nest Pensions, is a similar design for similar reasons, explicitly rooted in the findings of behavioural economics. And Peter Diamond and I, earlier this summer, were asked to give evidence to an Australian inquiry into how the default plan should be designed for their system of individual funded accounts. And I'll just go through what we recommended. At the end of the slides, I've got the link to the published version of our evidence. But we said, for accumulation, there should be a single national-wide default, not a different default for each industry. There should be a simple choice architecture within the default. So our starting point was to say, a good pension system should be designed so that a person who does nothing will be okay. And there should be a social attitude that doing nothing is an entirely okay thing to do. So you have the single default for people who make no choice. You've then got a small number of simple, curated funds, maybe 4 or 5 or 6, around that for people who want to make constrained choice. And then you've got outside that the whole of the market for those who want to make a choice from a wider range. You've got one account per person. That means one sort of record per person, so a single pension number, so that all your pension savings can be collected, you can find them all in one place, a single clearinghouse for contributions, a single record keeper, and then a level playing field between the government or quasi-government centralised account administration on the one hand and private providers on the other. So you're not saying the government should take over, the government should have an advantage over private providers. The government provides the architecture, but the public scheme faces the same charges from using that administrative structure as the private sector. And then we had a series of arrangements, of suggestions for drawdown as well. The key idea being, as I say, it should be okay to make no choice at all. Many people can't, others won't. So that's one approach. Another approach is the system in Sweden and other countries of notional defined contributions, which you know about. They mimic individual funded accounts, but they're not fully funded. They're either pay-as-you-go or partially funded. Workers' contributions this year pay for the pensions of this year's retired population. The government keeps a record of individual contributions and adds this year's contribution to your previous year's, to your existing accumulation, and then attributes to your accumulation this year a notional interest rate that's related to the increase in wages or changes in the wage bill. And then when the worker retires, the worker has a notional contribution. In other words, his or her cumulative record of contributions with notional interest applied over his or her working life. That's converted into an annuity based on 1, the size of the worker's contribution, 2, the age at which he or she starts pension, and 3, the remaining life expectancy of the person's birth cohort. So it's done on an actuarial basis. Advantages of this approach: it's simpler for workers than a system with a lot of choice. It's centrally administered, so you've got low administrative costs. It shares risk more widely than individual accounts. Workers in Sweden were hit by the financial crisis, and so were pensioners, but a lot less than workers in DC plans. It doesn't require the institutional capacity to manage multiple funded systems, multiple funded schemes. An increased saving may be the wrong policy. Peter Diamond and I, about 10 years ago, were asked to advise the government of China, who had introduced individual funded accounts. And they said, the essay question was, did we do the right thing? And our answer was no. One of the arguments for funding that people make is it will increase saving. Funding may increase saving. And in a country that's short of saving, that's helpful. But in China at the time, the savings rate was over 50% of GDP. China needed more saving, like it needed a hole in the head. So it's not always the right thing to increase saving. And final advantage of NDC, you can have a pay-as-you-go system, or it can be partially funded, and you can change the degree of funding over time. So it's very flexible. Country examples: Norway, Sweden I've mentioned, Norway, Poland, Latvia. So let me come on to a third challenge, which is addressing risk and uncertainty. We know that sharing risks normally raises welfare. As economists, we also know that corner solutions are generally suboptimal. With defined contribution individual accounts, all the risk is on the worker. With defined benefit final salary plans, all the risk is on the plan sponsor. Corner solutions are generally suboptimal. The right question to ask is, how should risk be shared? And that, to me, is a question that must be asked and isn't asked often enough. There are early examples of pension designs that do try to answer that question. In the Netherlands, you had they started off with final salary plans. That then moved to career average. And the basic design in the Netherlands is still career average DB, but with the proviso that those benefits will be paid in full only if the fund allows it. So you've got fund performance contingent career average DB. A plan in the Canadian province of New Brunswick that I will come on to in the next slide does the same thing. And you've got a trade union proposal for risk sharing that's currently been discussed in the UK. So the New Brunswick plan is the idea of target benefits, sometimes referred to as defined ambition. And the plan there was agreed between employers, trade unions, and the provincial government. The plan has 3 elements. Benefits are divided into base benefits and ancillary benefits. There is risk management through a stress test that assesses the financial health of the plan, and it's a very sophisticated risk management stress test. And then you've got a set of rules that say, if the fund is doing well, we pay career average DB. If there is a deficit, the rules say, here's what happens. And what happens includes higher contributions split between workers and employers, lower accrual rates for workers, for current workers, under indexing of benefits in payment. So if there's a deficit, all three of those things happen. But, and this is critical, you've then got a provision for catch-up. So if the fund takes a dip, accrual rates go down, contribution rates may go up, benefits are under-indexed. If the fund returns to health, you reverse the previous changes. You can possibly lower contributions. You can increase accrual rates above what you would have in a career average DB in order to address the previous shortfall. And similarly, you could over-index benefits in payment. So these risk-sharing plans, I think, are, when I say the wave of the future, they ought to be the wave of the future in people who think about these things, because if the two extremes are wrong, then surely you're better off with some sort of sensible design in the middle. So conclusion, very briefly, lessons for pension design. As economic and institutional capacity increases, what it becomes feasible for a country to do, those options widen, but more complex isn't necessarily better. New Zealand has a very simple system. It's got a non-contributory tax-financed pension, and it's then got simple, cheaply administered savings accounts, KiwiSaver with auto-enrolment. It's a simple system, not because New Zealand isn't capable of administering a more complex system. It's a simple system because that's what they prefer. And finally, students sometimes say to me, at the end of all this, what really matters for pensions? And my answer is only two things really matter. One is output growth. As I've said, pay-as-you-go and funding are merely different financial mechanisms for organising claims on future output. So what matters is not pay-as-you-go or funding. It's what is future output going to be, and does funding increase output in ways that pay-as-you-go can't or not. So output growth is the one thing, is one key thing that matters. The other is effective government. And that's true for any type of pension plan. 25 years ago, when the World Bank was promoting individual funded accounts, the argument was get government out of the pension, government out of pensions. Simply not true. You need an effective government will run a pay-as-you-go system responsibly, and it will create the macroeconomic stability and regulatory capacity necessary for private funded pensions to flourish. Bad government will make stupid, irresponsible pay-as-you-go promises that can't be kept. They will delay reform. But equally, they're likely to generate inflation. Regulatory capacity is likely to be limited and of variable quality. And there are some countries, and I won't name country names because you never know which nationalities are in the audience, but you say, looking at a basket case country, would you rather be a state pensioner or a private pensioner? And the answer is, I would rather be the citizen of another country. So effective government really matters. Economics matters because of all the things I've been talking about, but politics matters as well. It is, I know that I went to a conference in the Netherlands about 6 or 7 years ago. The people in the Netherlands were all very worried about the problems of the Netherlands pension system. And foreign experts like me all said, we'd love to have the problems that the Netherlands have. They manage their system very well. No system is perfect, I've said that, but they manage their system very well. Sweden manages its system very well. So does Canada. So it can be done, but it's not just a question of getting the design right. It's a question of getting the politics right. The politics is the difficult bit. Economics is easier. I'm not as stupid as I look. There are good reasons why I'm an academic economist, not a politician. To the politicians amongst you, you're enormously important. You know, good luck. I hope it goes well. So let me end there. Happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's a pleasure to stay here with you again. It's your turn. If you have any question, please. We have enough time up to the break for the coffee. And
how wonderful, I can see people.
yeah. There is a microphone.
Nothing, is only a comment. I think, did you forget that the first to apply NDC was Italy in 1995? And maybe it was not really well done because the last decisions were done by politicians and not by the people that constructed the theory. The theory was constructed in the same time in Italy and in Sweden. Nothing else. It's only a comment.
We are going to take several questions, and up to them, there is another.
Hi, my name's Mary Hardy. I'm interested in your views on the relationship between the employer-sponsored pension and the government-sponsored pension, because it seems to me that historically governments were happy to encourage employers to do part of the work of retirement security. And employers are now pretty much opting out, and almost all the reasons that we learned as young actuaries why employers would do that are not as strong as they used to be. And yet, it's not clear that the countries where the employers are opting out are the sort of countries like the US, where there's a great desire for government to step in and do a lot. I guess I'm asking, where do you see that relationship evolving?
Some other question? There and...
Oh, hi, good morning. I would like to know if you have any specific take on the Spanish pension system, or what will be the best next step that the system will need to take in order to move from the actual regime.
Thank you. Hi, it's Tom Terry. I'm thinking about normal retirement age in a defined benefit system such as a Social Security system. And what are your thoughts about the disparate impact of such a system given differences in longevity amongst different subpopulations? And of course that creates a challenge because those differences in longevity are now much more apparent among the public. It presents a problem for governments attempting to raise retirement age in a normal, standard sort of way. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you. Let me take those in turn. Yes, the NDC design was put forward simultaneously in Sweden and Italy. Sweden implemented successfully. In Italy, the necessary actions were postponed and politicians kicked the can down the road to the point where in 2011, when Italy were facing problems with in international financial markets, the then pensions minister, my friend Elsa Fornero, had to compress 30 years of necessary reform into a single reform package. I've said pensions are a device to allow young people like you to make lifetime plans for your old age. Pensions are a long-run instrument. Facing people with sudden large shocks is very bad pension design. Having to do 30 years of contributions, of reforms in one go, was absolutely essential, but a very bad thing to have to do. It was a result of 30 years of political failure before 2011. Sweden is interesting because the Swedish rule says if our NDC plan has a projected deficit, it's got to be fixed this year. And when I wrote my report, I said, but you've got the option of spreading risk over a longer period. Why are you giving up the gains from risk sharing? And to my surprise, every person in Sweden I talked to said the same thing. They said, we don't trust those bastards in government. The Swedes are terrified of government failure. And they did something very clever that I think other countries should do. When they set up their reform, when they were assembling it, they put together something called the Pensions Group, which comprised all representatives of all the major parties then in Parliament. And I'm told that if you want to murder someone, all 14 of you should stick the knife into the body, because that way nobody knows who's actually killed the person. And this was the idea of the Pensions Group. All the major political parties were in it together. None of them could blame the others. But the Swedes then did something very clever. After the reform was enacted, they kept the Pensions Group in existence. And it's still in existence today. And it's the guardians of the reform. And when people like me make suggestions, you know, it's the Pensions Group that has to say, maybe we will think about this, or no, that would violate the core principles of the reform. So it's partly the quality of politics, it's partly the institutions you set up. Canada has a partially funded public DB plan. They reckon to get 20% of their benefits from pension funds. The funds are administered by the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. That board is set up at arm's length from government, and Canada has the political capacity for that arm's length independence to be genuine. Canada also did something else that I only learnt of recently that you probably know about that's very clever. The law that sets up the Canada Pension Plan has the same protection as the Canadian Constitution. It can't just be a simple majority in the federal parliament that changes the law. It's got to be a 2/3 majority in the parliaments of provinces representing 2/3 of the Canadian population. So there are ways you can help politicians, but ultimately politics does matter. Employer-sponsored plans, as you rightly say, employers are busy moving from DB to DC because that removes their exposure to risk. And therefore people are saying government should step in. Now, government could step in, as in Canada, and have a public scheme, or governments could create the architecture in which private plans could flourish. Nest Pensions in the UK is a very good example. It's in its early stages. At the moment, it is limited to workers whose employers are affiliated with the plan. I'm hoping that over time, it will become an option for any individual to hold their pension savings with Nest if that's what they wish. So the government could set up a framework for individuals to save. or the government could encourage the development of private target benefit plans, or there is a more radical set of options. I was at a conference in Rome 2 weeks ago, and I was fascinated to learn that in Tanzania, the covered wage bill is 10% of GDP. Electronic financial transactions, mobile financial transactions, are 50% of GDP, which suggests that it might be possible to have individual pension savings organized not through employers or through government, or the government would set up the apparatus, but it would then be direct transfers from individuals to their pension savings. Now, the disadvantage of that is that's a DC type arrangement, and as I've indicated, it would be better to have something with wider risk sharing than a DC plan. But the answer is there are a range of options other than the traditional employer plan, and I think that wider range should be explored. Spanish pension system. This is going to be a disappointing answer, I'm afraid. When I worked, I spent 2 years on sabbatical from LSE working for the World Bank, and I was shocked by the way in which senior World Bank officials would go into countries that they didn't know much about and say, here's what you've got to do. And this became the joke between us was this was the Poland must problem. And when I was asked to edit a World Bank book, the deal was I would have absolute editorial authority, and when I got people's drafts, the first thing I did was search through the whole book for the word must, and I left in only 5 of them. Countries must make a clear choice between this way or that way. That's legitimate. So I don't know enough about Spain to come in and say Poland must. I think the general principles I've talked about apply to Spain as they apply anywhere else. I think pension plans in deficit, in an ideal world, deficits need to be addressed, but in an ideal world, by governments taking a long-run view. Writing my report for Sweden made me very wistful. Because of the pensions group, pension reform in Sweden takes a long-run view. If you look at my country, the United Kingdom, there is a pension reform every 3 weeks. I exaggerate slightly. A lot of the reforms are motivated purely by short-term party political gain. And this is not the way to run a pension system. So what I would say to Spain, as in other countries, is think about institutions like the pensions group in Sweden, a pensions board that can take a long-run view of reform, which then can make the necessary reforms, but can think about doing them over a longer time horizon. Normal retirement age. The problem with any retirement age is that at age 65, some people have a long remaining life expectancy and others don't. And it's richer people who tend to have a longer life expectancy. Systematic evidence that poorer people have a lower life expectancy, and evidence in some countries that the gap is getting wider. And the question is what to do about it. There was an eminent British economist who said about something different. He said, this is one of those classes of problems that one looks straight in the eye and then passes by. And we can't pass it by, it's too important. There is no very good answer. There are partial answers. You can obviously allow people with health problems to access their pension earlier. You could have a system that says, after you have contributed for 40 years, you can retire, which means people who start work at 17 get their 40 years before people who don't start work until their mid-20s. That helps. You can do what the United States does and have a pension system that's got built-in redistribution so that poorer workers get more pension per dollar of contribution than richer workers, which to some extent means poorer workers with a shorter remaining life expectancy at retirement are at least partially compensated with a higher pension. But that, of course, doesn't help those poorer workers who never reach pension age. So the answer is hugely important. And clearly, the long-run solution is to try to narrow the gap. And that gets one into issues way outside pensions, like how does one address rising inequality? And how does one improve the welfare state and have access to education and high-quality healthcare, and addressing the hopelessness that has led to the opioid epidemic in the United States. So there's a lot of long-run policies. In terms of pure pension design, what you can do, sadly, is rather limited. But what you can't do is to say, because of this problem, you can never raise earliest pension age, because then the whole system blows a gasket. So in a way, it's one of those horrible problems where everything you do is wrong.
We get enough time for another round.
So Andrew Cairns from the UK. You were talking about in some settings where too much choice is a bad thing and it results in people making suboptimal decisions. And I'm wondering about if you have a system where you have income drawdown in its sort of full flexibility, is that an example of too much choice? You know, so either people spend money far too quickly or they're far too cautious, and etc. So what are your views on that?
Thank you very much. I'm Abraham Hernandez. And many things have changed from the late 19th century. Of course, longevity, which we will talk more about during these days. Employment, I mean, lifelong employment is not there anymore. Family has shrunk. So we need to think differently about pensions and the sponsoring of the state, of the employee, of the employer, only DB/DC, and I think flexibility, it's a key feature. Flexibility, as you say, of funding, flexibility of sources of income, flexibility on pensions. We need, as in the Netherlands, we don't, I mean, we have to stop thinking of a fixed pension. I mean, the price of everything changes. The price of airfares, the price of gas, the price of food changes, and so why not the pension might change? Also mobility. I mean, why should I stay in a very expensive place to spend my pensioner's income? And you can go to Mexico, you can go to Portugal, you can go to other places who are cheaper, etc. So traditional arrangement, traditional models will not fit what is not traditional anymore. And probably you have some other examples of there's no anymore this three-pillar system for retirement. I say now we have a Parthenon. We need many pillars to support a pension.
Sorry, just one question. You mentioned that, of course, increasing the workforce is one option for increasing future consumption or future available consumption. But you didn't talk much about immigration and how how lower immigration can affect future workforce. I wonder if you have any comments.
Anything else? No?
So can I just come back to the last question? So you were asking about immigration, is that right? Yes. Okay. Let me take them in order again. As you're saying, yes, I was saying too much choice reduces people's welfare. I can remember I was talking to a friend of mine at the time that my wife and I first got together, and this friend was asking what sort of person my wife was. And at one stage she interrupted me. She said, "Cut the crap, Nick." She said, "Does she shop?" And I'm glad to say the answer was no, not really. We neither of us do. Some people love shopping, some don't. My pensions example, and this is an English example, and if anybody can give me an international analogy, I would be grateful. Marks and Spencer's makes good quality, mass-produced clothes. Savile Row makes $10,000 exquisite tailor-made suits. My view is most people want a Marks and Spencer's pension. A simple, well-designed standard product that they can buy knowing it'll be okay and not having to worry about it too much. That doesn't mean there isn't room for Savile Row pensions, but that's the tail, not the dog. It's for people who are rich enough and interested enough to want to do it. So I would say less choice, or allowing people the option of making no choices or fewer choices is a good idea. A few years ago, our finance minister, note, our finance minister, not our pensions minister, announced that people would no longer be required to buy an annuity. And shortly afterwards, he announced that people would be allowed to draw down their pension savings in whatever way they wanted. And there are two worries. One worry is people will spend too much too soon. The other worry is people won't spend enough. If I am living off my pension savings, I am, quote unquote, spending my children's inheritance. And this is not fanciful, this is a phrase that my mother used to my brother and me. And we just said some rude words and said, absolute rubbish, you spend what you need. So some people will spend too little, either because they're worried about spending their children's inheritance, or because they're worried about the costs of long-term care, or because they don't understand life expectancy or present values or probabilities. So why did our finance minister do it? I'm sad to say this is an example of short-run party political gain. And I'm just as critical of other British governments. This is not a party political point, it's a pension design point. If you allow people to draw down more quickly, his bet was more people would draw down more quickly, and therefore more people would pay more taxes sooner, and he would get a fiscal windfall that would reduce the budget deficit and give him greater fiscal headroom in the run-up to the next election. That may be good politics. It is a terrible way to run a pension system. There are problems with annuity markets. I talked about them. One solution is to fix annuity markets, and there are directions of travel that would be useful there. Another way is to say, okay, we won't require people to buy an annuity, we will let them draw down, but then you should give them very strong nudges about the range of drawdown per year. So drawing it all down is nonsense. Drawing none of it down is usually nonsense. You should, I mean, in the United States, there is a tax penalty unless you withdraw more than a minimum but less than a maximum. So you've got a range of which there is no tax penalty. So you should nudge people over the speed of drawdown. Another thing that I haven't had time to talk about today, but is another part of the wave of the future, is the idea of a deferred annuity. And I've got a lot of sympathy for the sort of thinking that says people should be allowed to choose not to buy an annuity from the time they retire. They should be allowed to draw down their pension savings, but required, or at least nudged, to take out a deferred annuity, say from age 85, which means if someone retires at 70 and has a deferred annuity that starts paying at 85, they can then draw down over a known 15-year period. So I think there are lots of sensible things one can do, very few of which the British government has done. Flexibility. Yes, the world is changing. Pension design should try to accommodate that. you can do some of it through automatic adjustment. I mean, pensions are automatically indexed to price inflation or wage inflation or a mixture. Sweden has built a lot of automatic adjustment into its NDC design. That helps a pension plan to adjust to economic and demographic circumstances. The original Sweden thought was they would never need any discretionary adjustment. I think that was wrong, and I think the Swedes now realize that was wrong. You can never have a system that will never need discretionary adjustment, but you can go a very long way with automatic adjustment. And if you then have something like a pensions group to supervise any discretionary changes, one stands a better chance of having a coherent plan. One of the thoughts that I thought about a long time ago was the idea of the welfare state as a snail shell. A snail carries its house on its back. And a welfare state, a snail shell, you would have welfare state rights, pensions, medical rights, etc., that are portable. And one way of doing that, I mentioned the electronic payments in Tanzania, that you have individual contributions to a simple, cheaply managed savings plan that would follow the person around wherever he or she worked or lived. And so there are ways of doing that. But whilst I take, up to a point I agree, you need pension systems that can adjust to changing circumstances. On the other hand, you need things to have enough long-run predictability to allow people to make plans over their life courses. So too many changes too quickly, too many changes too quickly is bad pension design. Too much flexibility risks facing people with too many choices. So, as always, this is a second best problem where you have trade-offs between different desirable features. And when you talked about no longer a three-pillar model, I was always a big critic of the three-pillar model because it presupposes a single pension design. And the whole point of what I was talking about this morning is saying there are many different ways of doing it. You can say, all right, the first tier is a state-run pay-as-you-go pension aimed mainly at poverty relief. The second tier is a mandatory consumption smoothing element, and the third tier is a voluntary pension. You know, you can frame it that way, and to that extent, you have a fairly general formulation. But the sort of the three-pillar model as it was originally formulated is far too much one size fits all. Immigration. The issue is the following. If a country is short of young workers, it could import as many workers as it needed from other countries if a worker was simply a standard thing like a television set. If there's a shortage of television sets, you import a whole lot of television sets. But of course, workers aren't like that. They are people. They have cultures, they have attitudes, they have languages. And therefore, immigration, which allowing, immigration by younger workers may be economically beneficial, but there is an issue of absorptive capacity, some of which can be dealt with by public policy, some of which needs time. And an illustration of absorptive capacity that is entirely benign. A colleague of mine at LSE, his wife is a family doctor just north of London. And she was on our heavy early morning radio political programme talking about how the maternity services in her bit of Hertfordshire were hopelessly overstretched. And the reason was, this was an area where a lot of Polish people migrated to. People who migrate tend to be young. They're often married. Young people tend to have children. Polish families are often Catholic and hence have more children than the average. So here you had a lot of hard-working, legal immigrants, working hard, paying taxes, bringing up their families, but there was a bulge in the birth rate, and this was stretching the maternity system. So you could fix that by having funds that can give extra resources to areas where you have a sharp increase in population, whether through immigration or other reasons. But there are also cultural issues. So the answer is, where you've got a shortage of young workers, immigration should be optimized, not maximized. There is a lot of xenophobia. There is a lot of fake news. That needs to be addressed head on. But there is one of the reasons why the UK made this catastrophic mistake of voting to leave the EU was that economists say globalization brings economic advantages. That is true in aggregate, but the advantages are spread unequally. And good economists say you get the macro gains from globalization, but then you redistribute to compensate the losers. And we did the first and not enough of the second. So there are a lot of people who felt left out and believed that immigration was the cause, even though it wasn't. So the answer is, this is an area where the economics goes one way and the politics may go the other way. And it's got to be handled both as an education problem about what the facts are, but also as a political problem.
Thank you very much, Nick. I think it's time to have a break for coffee. At 11:30, we are going to start the parallel sessions. Please feel free to go to the room where the topics that are in your interest must deal with. So thank you very much, Professor Barr. It has been a pleasure for us.
Thank you.